Greetings and welcome to my channel. I'm your presenter, Dr. Paul Kiritsis, and today we are going to be engaging in another episode of Culture Wars. So last time I had Charity Ann Ross on the channel, and this time I have another guest who will be talking about his life and about straddling 2 or 3 different cultures as well. So I will allow him to introduce himself. Go right ahead, Ishwar.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, my name is Ishwar, and you can call me Ash. I am a 5th generation Malaysian from with Indian background. So my great grandparents 5 generations ago moved to Malaysia.
Yes. So, and then obviously you were born and raised in Malaysia, and then you immigrated to Melbourne, Australia, right? So, so the first thing I'm going to get you to do is just tell me a little bit about where you were born, raised, kind of like your early formative experiences, and then what actually brought you to Australia.
I was born in Kuala Lumpur, Paul. So pretty much that's where I grew up. So when my ancestors, when they moved to Kuala Lumpur, Malaya back then, it was known as Malaya, they settled in Kuala Lumpur because they were spices and textile merchants, and that was where the Indian community back then sort of established what we call as Little India. So all the merchants sort of built their businesses in the city, and yeah, pretty much that was where I grew up.
Interesting. So tell me a little bit about your family of origin, right? So like in your own family of origin, which family member is of eminent status, and then talk a little bit about whether the culture, because you're of Indian background, is it predominantly patriarchal or matriarchal? Talk about these influences.
That's a very interesting question, Paul, because when I was growing up, just watching gender roles, playing out, I always assumed that it was a patriarchal culture because of how, I suppose, how, in the West, how a lot of discourses around feminism and social structures,
right?
And what I understood of that, and then when I viewed my own culture, I assumed it was patriarchal,
right?
But as I suppose, as I was, I grew up, and then I became more familiar with it, and I saw how, I guess I went a bit deeper. I've always had a great relationship with my grandmother, and just hearing her perspective and centering her point of view was when I realized historically it was a matrilineal culture. Yeah,
right. And I think I remember that you've mentioned to me once or twice that you were essentially raised by your grandmother, right? You have very strong roots to your grandmother, right? You have a strong emotional tie and link to grandma, right?
Yeah.
And this is your maternal grandmother or paternal grandmother?
Maternal grandmother.
Maternal. Okay, so it's your mum's mum. Okay. Yeah. And then what about dad and mum? When you were growing up, were they present as well?
Not really. Well, my dad had addiction issues,
right?
Alcohol addiction issues. That caused, I suppose, a lot of issues in the families. So never really had a consistent time in my life where I had both parents present. So it was
Okay.
quite volatile. Yeah. So hence why, my grandma was the matriarch, and she looked after all of us, and
The
hence.
the pillar of destructibility and invincibility, right? So yeah, yep. Yes, it's very, very reminiscent of my situation too, because my grandmother played a very similar role in my life. She was the rock, so talking about, growing up and the challenges that you faced. So you grew up in an essentially Indian home, right? With Indian influences. Religiously, how did you identify in Malaysia?
It was very confusing, Paul. It was very
Yeah.
confusing because so Malaysia is a Muslim country,
Right.
Predominantly a Muslim country, and we grew up as minorities,
right?
And the discourse, or I suppose what you learn about monotheism, was very deeply ingrained in the education system. And that's the culture war between monotheistic cultures and polytheistic cultures, where one is always dominant than the other. So I think in my early years, I grew up feeling really ashamed of identifying myself as Hindu. So I would sort of use, I'm spiritual, or I'm this, I'm that, and just, I suppose, sanitizing the whole thing, because the discourse was that we were called cow worshippers or stone worshippers, or people will always pull up the caste system, and so yeah, it was considered a pagan religion,
right?
We were heathens. So I think in my early years, because I grew up in that dominant culture, I carried a lot of shame about it. But I suppose my grandma, having my grandma as a rock, who sort of watching her and how she practiced her faith and her culture, and it kind of sort of, in a way, I kind of made a 360 degrees turn. I also went to a Catholic school as well, a Portuguese missionary school. Right. So I had Islam as the dominant culture of the country, and then I went to a Catholic missionary school, and I grew up in a Hindu household, so it was pretty fucked up. It was, so imagine.
So there was so within Malaysia itself, being predominantly Islam, there was a sense, I don't know, like a sense of superiority when it came to other religions, and they denigrated and debased and maybe issued demeaning comments towards other religions that were more, I don't know, polytheistically flavored or something, right?
Yep, okay, 100%.
Yeah.
We were all lumped, I suppose, all polytheistic belief system were all lumped into one category as, the other, or, the kafirs or the heathens. So there was no real, I suppose, there was no real sort of intercultural curiosity. So,
right.
So, and like what you said, one culture was deemed as superior because,
right.
And I suppose it does come from that, but it's a very binary way of thinking that, if you have one leader or one god or one book, then you must be right.
Yes.
Whereas when you have many gods and many books and many parts and many ways, it's confusing.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's difficult to reconcile different opinions and different perspectives sometimes, particularly when you're being told one thing, by your family of origin within kind of that more domestic environment or household, and then you're receiving different messages when you're going to school, right? Or at your vocation or whatever, right? Where you work. It can be really, really difficult. And then, the whole situation is further compounded by the fact that you have individuals in the mainstream culture that are vilifying, aspects of, of another culture, right? So like yeah, so it's difficult. It can be difficult to navigate. So you were in Malaysia for how long? Like,
So
yep,
pretty much, I, the large part of my life for 30 years, I would say. So I left when I was 30. So for
right,
30 years, I had my foundational years was in Malaysia.
Malaysia. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. And then what was the precipitating factor that led to your move or your decision to actually come to Australia?
Homophobia, I
Mm,
probably would say. Yeah,
mm,
I think with every other aspect as well. I think Malaysia was a great country to live in, but I think because of that religious sort of conditioning,
mm.
queer phobia, homophobia was always there. I think I was kind of lost, as in I really didn't feel like I could be myself, and also I think the older I became, I realized that the traveler culture is in
Right,
my blood as well.
right.
So I had this sort of awakening where I felt like, no, this is getting too stagnant. I need to
Yeah,
I need to see the world. I was
yeah,
thirsting for something new. Yeah.
yeah. Absolutely. You wanted to embark on a nomadic pilgrimage and see different parts of the world and experience different cultures,
Yeah.
right? So that can be extremely eye-opening and it can lead to a much more comprehensive psychological worldview, right?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah,
Mm.
um, so hmm, I think we've spoken a little bit about gender roles and expectations, and then these being reflected to a certain degree in your own immediate or your own nuclear family. I think here in Australia, I don't live in Australia anymore. I live in America, but it's when we say nuclear family, we mean father, mother, right? Children usually too. So that's the typical nuclear family, and then there's variations of that, right? So, so you didn't grow up in a nuclear family per se, even when you were living in Malaysia, right? So you were raised essentially by your grandmother, right? So you didn't really have any experience of living in a nuclear culture. Siblings were around. Um, then the precipitating factor which led to your immigration to Australia was homophobia. And then in coming to Australia, um, what was your formative impression of Australia when juxtaposed with Malaysia? I know that you didn't really experience a secular, nuclear family growing up, but how did you think that Australia was different from Malaysia? Was it different or was the experience more of the same for you?
Mm. That you see, growing up in Malaysia, as much as it is still Asia and we still live in a collective culture,
Yeah.
and the concept of the nuclear family, mm, it was imposed on us.
Yeah.
I suppose through because we did grow up in the education system was Western.
Yes.
A lot of the thoughts, a lot of the ideas were Western narratives. So I suppose my generation, my grandmother's generation, saw it as a collective, extended family living.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas by my mom's generation, because my mom and dad also went to missionary schools,
Right.
and by the time it came to my generation, I think I was very whitewashed.
Right.
So I thought, oh my God, that's like what my grandma did was like, oh shit, that's so village. Like, oh, that's not sophisticated. And that's
Yeah.
how
It's
people
more
live.
it's more bucolic and rustic, right? It's like it's out. Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
wishy-washy and very sort of like, so I was conditioned to think, um, um, it's really interesting. It was never the education system. And this is how I suppose the whole white supremacy culture works, right?
Mm-hmm.
It infilters schools, thought, thinking, language, everywhere. So if the dominant discuss of what you know of life or what's being taught in school is only coming from one culture,
Yeah.
then, and, you know, always looking up to the West, you know, being colonized, you know, Western education system is elevated, blah, 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 blah. So, you know, I think I carried that internalization, and I thought I understood the West a lot more than I did the East. So when I came to Australia, I thought, I got this, I know how this works.
Right.
But I think the reality was that what you know in theory and what you know in practice is two different things. And I think what shocked me was how individualistic this society was, how close it was, and that was when I think the word culture shock kind of makes me sound like I came from a cave, which I didn't. I did know a lot about the world, but I think to experience it in your body and to actually live a system of what you read, which in theory sounded amazing.
Yeah.
It's all about the individual rights and all about the self. And then I realized, and I think that's when I went onto a bit of a journey and realized there's good in both, that you need to explore both.
Yeah.
In some cases, living in a collective culture like where I come from, your business becomes everybody's business. Now, if you, let's just say, if you are born to fit that system, then perfect. You've got a great network of support around you, where if you were to fall between the cracks, the system will hold you. But if you're the odd one out like me, and you don't really feel like you fit in, then the scrutiny becomes a lot more elevated, and you can feel a lot more isolated, which was what drove me to leave. And then when I came here, and then I realized, but it's also, I mean, you know, in a very individualistic society, it's not very easy to make friends here. It's not very easy to sort of, you know, move into a social circle here. It's all very guarded, and it's all about, very much about the glorification of the self. It's like, so I think that's what I think I had to come to terms with, just to experience both ends, and not to dismiss one and glorify one, but to see how within context both can be destructive and I suppose, what's the word?
Insidious or harmful to self, or
harmful to self, and also it can function well. It can function well.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we need that clash of cultural and psychological worldviews to reflect certain things back to us, right? You know, maybe this isn't the best way of doing something. As you know, our particular societies, Western democratic capitalist societies, do tend to normalize certain qualities. So, you know, we live in a heteronormative society, which caters to that. And then everything that falls in the periphery is kind of just like under rug swept, and, you know, or those individuals are forced to come up with, I don't know, alternative ways of dealing with that heteronorms that exist, right? You know, they'll try and compensate, or they'll try and fit into the system somehow. But these are, I suppose, norms that don't necessarily benefit their lifestyles, right? Right.
They don't. And you can also somehow in the West, as much as you can say that a lot of Western countries have sort of have gone to a more secular, liberal, democratic system, but the Judeo-Christian thinking is still so deeply embedded. And I think coming from a theistic
yeah.
culture, and this is where I think sometimes the West dismisses polytheistic culture as many gods. But if you change the word gods to ideas,
Yeah.
and it changes how you view it. Like,
Yeah.
I come from a culture where we carry many views and many ideas and many school of thoughts. And I mean, and if you look at Indian culture, it's there's 330 million gods, it says in the scriptures.
Yeah.
Which means that
The
there's
deities.
the deities, yeah.
Right. There's so many
Correct.
of them. Yeah.
And there's so many of them.
Each of them embodying a different universal force or quality or energy, right? That's their personifications of qualities and forces, right? That exist in nature. Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And each of them have a different school of thought, a different practice, a different sort of thinking behind it.
Yeah.
So, and if you're already exposed to a culture that is so diverse, and that, you know, and that also comes down to sexuality as well, where very similar to your culture too, Paul, you know, ancient Greek culture, you know, there was room to explore all the gray bits. It wasn't hard-lined.
Yeah.
And I find the West is still holding on to the hardline views of the Judeo-Christian conditioning.
Yep. Yeah.
And I struggle with that sometimes. Yeah.
Yes, we're all deeply conditioned by it to some degree. Do you know what I mean? We were born into it. It's part of our cultural humus and inheritance as well. And it's been there for thousands of years, right? So the Judeo-Christian tradition extends back thousands and thousands of years. And as we know, there are profound, socio-political consequences to certain myths that have been written in the past, particularly the Judeo-Christian myths, right? So which attempted to elevate the masculine over the feminine and equated the masculine with certain qualities like, strength and being phlegmatic, right? And stoic. And then the feminine with emotion, being over emotional and sexual and weak and slovenly, right? Right. So that's how you can see that the feminine was devalued and the masculine was idealized. And we've basically subscribed unconsciously to that philosophy and to those modes of thought for a very, very long time. And only now we're trying to divest ourselves from them, right? With the emergence of certain movements like the feminist movement. Yep, sorry. Yep. You were saying, you were going to say something?
I totally agree. Totally agree with that, because because, you know, the Catholic Church or Christianity was the dominant power in the West.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you go back to the whole, you know, idea or the discourse around Eve, Adam and Eve being the one who seduced Adam and took the forbidden fruit.
Yeah. She tempted, apparently she was the one that initially tempted him to take it, right? So she's the wily one. She's the one that can't be trusted. So the message that you're communicating to others is that women actually can't be trusted.
Can't be trusted.
Yeah.
And also, you know, Eve was created from the rib of
That's correct.
Adam.
Yep.
So your women are, you know, the feminine energy, or women are the offshoot of the alpha male.
That's correct. They're a secondary creation after the male. So therefore, they're further away from God or from the divine than what men are. It's a pretty interesting insinuation, and it is made by those texts, by those biblical texts. And as we said, they have far-reaching political consequences. You know, they degrade women, you know, and it's reflected, or has been reflected, in our society for a very long time. Only now do we see, you know, the situation and the milieu is changing. Which, one other thing that I wanted to ask you, which I was really interested about, you know, talking about culture clashes, is boundaries, right? Boundaries. So think about interpersonal, physical, financial boundaries, you know, both in, you know, in terms of your culture of origin, which is the Indian culture, maybe the Malaysian culture, and then Australian culture. They vary, right, from one to the other. So what's the most striking or noticeable one between your culture of origin, or your mother culture, and your adopted culture, so the Australian culture? Boundaries. Like, think physical boundaries, think emotional boundaries. Like what is very different between the Indian culture and say the Australian culture?
You mean the stark difference or the similarity?
Like the stark differences. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. So in Greek tradition or in Greek culture, but a lot of Southern European men, it's very customary to greet by kissing one another on the cheeks, right? So it's just a customary greeting. Whereas, if you think in terms of Australia, maybe it would be more appropriate. A handshake would be more appropriate. Kissing on the cheeks would intimate something else, that you were homosexual or whatever. So, does that make sense? So there's variations in boundaries. So yeah.
I could definitely relate to that. I can use that thread, Paul, because so maybe the idea of masculinity is very different. I think, as interestingly enough, I find there's almost a worship of masculine culture here through sports, and it almost sort of validates that toxic masculine culture.
Yeah.
And it's deeply ingrained in the society here. And also, I suppose you can then go to body image, because I come from a culture where historically, mythologically, men were much more feminine. Men, and I'm not saying patriarchy also didn't exist in the Indian culture. We historically in the Hindu culture, because we see time as cyclical.
Right.
So in one era, patriarchy will rule, and then in another era, matriarchy will rise. We call it the battle between Shiva and Shakti, the masculine and the feminine, the divine masculine, the divine feminine. So, and at some point, both the masculine and the feminine comes together, and that's, I suppose, when you talk about queer identity, that's the spectrum we live in, and which was sort of accepted. So even in a hyper masculine culture, Hindu culture, historically, men were not depicted as having muscles, or not in the same Western context.
Right. No. So say, like a culture like maybe ancient Sparta, where the emphasis was on war and being victorious in war, and that might be the epitome of toxic masculinity, if you want to put it that way, right? In that the children or the males were raised to be warriors, fierce warriors in battle, and that was basically their only purpose in life. That's the purpose that they served, was to grow up and be mean, lean fighting machines, right? Capable of winning wars. So that may be a permutation of more toxic masculinity, where there's no balance, right? There's no integration, or there's an over idealization of one energy over the other. Right?
Because if you look at, because I'm not just blindly making a statement without context here.
Right.
Right. Because if you look at ancient Hindu sculptures or artwork or depiction of the deities, like Krishna, for example, very feminized, very soft-featured, with wearing lots of jewels and feathers, and they're quite opulent.
Yeah. It's very aesthetic, right?
It's very aesthetic, and it's all about I suppose conquering the intellect, because the intellect is seen as the raging masculine, and it was all about the battle of the self, of escaping from the cycle of life and death,
right?
Rather than warring heroes. And it was never a hero worshipping culture as such, because also, like, as I said, in the masculine lineage of the Hindu faith, the you also have the opposite feminine lineage of the Hindu faith. So a lot of Hindus do believe that the ultimate supreme is feminine. Is
Right.
We worship
Yes.
the womb. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because life originates and comes from the womb, right? So yeah, it's fascinating. And when I always think of, I don't know, matrilineal, my mind always goes to the Minoan culture on Crete, right? So one of the oldest cultures, maybe the oldest European culture to emerge. So in Minoan Crete, when you look at, some of the artifacts, like you look at the frescoes on the temple palaces in Knossos, you notice that women stand alongside men as being of equal eminence and status, right? Particularly in religion and religious duties, and more secular duties as well. You have the priests, but then you also have the priestesses. And one thing that struck me was the fact that the men are portrayed in that much more feminine manner, like they have that feminine guise to them, like they have longer hair, slender bodies, very thin ring-like waists, right? Kind of very lean, dark, because men were apparently outdoors more than women, whereas women are portrayed more with white skin. But they seem more, they're equals, right? There's not much in terms of gender disparity, not much that we can assume from looking at the frescoes and all the other artifacts, right? So it feels as though they were more of an egalitarian society like the Egyptians were. And it feels as though, whereas the Romans, the Greeks, the Jews, they were kind of more patriarchal, right? So they honored the masculine, what we call the toxic masculinity more. But obviously these are assumptions that we're making based on what we know and what we see, in museums, the artifacts. There's not much remaining from the Minoan culture where we can come up with maybe a more certain opinion, right, about what the culture was actually like. So we're making assumptions based on what we see, the evidence that actually exists. Yeah, and from a particular point of view too, right? With our modern day contemporary minds, we make appraisals of these ancient artifacts and what these might be showing. We know
and how
that
we romanticize
the past. Yeah, so we don't exactly know what else was going on at the time. We can assume that we know, but one thing that we can see from certain frescoes, like particularly the Minoan frescoes, is that there's a certain fundamental harmony and interconnectedness with nature. It feels as though they may have experienced themselves as parts of nature and not separate from nature. There was maybe a cultural humility in the eyes of the universe. That makes it, they were more humble. They didn't attempt to dominate, manipulate matter the way that we do, right? Take advantage, take things out of the earth, use them to our advantage. That seems to be a more masculine endeavor, where you're attempting to dominate over nature, whereas they seem to be more in line and, connected to nature, seeing themselves as part of nature and going with the flow. I think you were alluding to it with Indian culture as well. I think Indian culture is very similar, but that may be a kind of a ubiquitous or overarching theme in pre-Christian societies, right? They were more matriarchal, right? More tied or intimately connected with the lunar phases, the moon, the stars, being more attuned to these cycles, right? It was a very yep. Go. Yeah.
Those are little, I wouldn't say evidence, but there's always a chain link. Like a culture just doesn't arrive somewhere.
Yeah.
So in a way, you can sort of figure out, if you sort of backtrack and hold that thread, that okay, highly likely it must have been a matrilineal or a matriarchal, or at least it would have given the feminine an amount of I wouldn't use the word power, but maybe it kept itself accountable. Maybe there was there was something, there was some back and forth sort of element to it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you look at Carl Jung and he talks about the animus and the anima, right? So the feminine and the masculine within the soul itself. You have the yin and the yang, right? In the esoteric Chinese cultures and philosophies, when one energy becomes too dominant or overpowering, the other one will emerge, to counteract that particular energy or balance them somewhat, right? So there's a self-corrective function in nature, right? I think that's what we're alluding to and talking about. I totally believe in that. And it feels as though we're kind of swinging, the pendulum is swinging a little bit, right? One thing that I wanted to talk about is stereotypes, prejudice and discrimination, because we alluded to it earlier with homophobia, right? So we know that those are inextricably connected and kind of form like this causal chain within any socio-cultural or socio-historical context, right? So what's the single most important action you feel that we can take in attenuating or dispelling the noxious effects of violence that might be racially motivated in Australia?
It to an extent, whether it's sexuality discrimination or racial discrimination, you do see a thread of it all linking back to this masculine culture.
Right.
It does come from that, and I think Western culture hold that thinking on another level. Like even slavery, when you talk about slavery, I mean,
yeah. Well, you were saying that we romanticize certain cultures, and definitely we sometimes do romanticize the ancient Greek culture because ancient Greeks were allowed to have slaves, right? So now it is no longer permissible to hold a slave. So yeah, there is an attempt of, attempted idealization of certain cultures, particularly in looking back in the past, right? Looking back to a golden era. Somehow there's a part of us that needs to connect with a golden era, that at some stage things were better, right?
Within context, you're right.
Yeah. Right?
Within context, like at some stage things were better for certain people and things were bad for certain people. But when you think about it, I think, I mean, I'm not trying to minimize where the world is at right now.
Yeah.
But we are in one of that cyclical change as well.
So do you feel that maybe education is the way out of the pitfalls of discrimination and prejudice? Do you feel that if people are educated on certain topics, it'll change their perspective?
I find education is such a big word, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah.
It's such a, how do you educate? How do you uncondition? Because more than educate, I think there's a lot of unconditioning that needs to be done. And and also, I suppose, to an extent, it's also about understanding what power people hold, and what is it like to give up that power? Not to say to destroy it or dismantle it, but to give up the idea of the power, like with race and sexuality. In both instances, you can see that the dominant culture is afraid of letting go of what they have because of what may be taken away from them. And it's the idea of, so educate. How do you educate that? How do you tame a lion not to eat a billy goat?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I understand what you're saying. Hang on. Okay. Yes, I think what you're alluding to is the fact that sometimes we're very emotionally invested in our privileges And there's a part of us that doesn't really want to relinquish them, despite the fact that outwardly we may explicitly declare that, equality is important and living in an egalitarian society is important where everyone gets treated equally. When the culture is skewed so that it benefits a demographic that we're part of, sometimes it's difficult letting go of that privilege, right? I think that's what you're alluding to.
And also when we say educate, and I think I thought about that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yes, that's a fundamental, I suppose, approach, but what education? Because in a lot of ways, how people look at education is still through a Western system, where let's draft out a plan, let's have a mission, and then let's measure that, and then let's fix this whole idea of let's fix this now. And I think we just need to rethink about what education means from a holistic perspective.
Right.
Because I know a lot of people, I work in community health, and I know a lot of people in my profession say one thing, but then live their lives in another way. So you're intelligent, clearly, but where's your wisdom?
There's a certain level of hypocrisy that goes on, that's for sure, right? Yeah. You're saying something because it's right to say it, right? So it's fair, it's right, but you don't exactly conform to it, in your day-to-day quotidian life. So there's a degree of hypocrisy there. I think we can all be guilty of that to some degree, right? So it happens a lot of the time, unfortunately. So one thing that I wanted to talk about was eating habits and rituals in your culture, which are specific in your culture, and I'm sure that you have many. What's, like a food or a dish that you really enjoyed back home, one that your grandmother made that you no longer have here? There was a lot. There was a lot that's gone. Yeah, a lot that disappeared with my grandma, because by the time, I suppose, my mom or me came to a realization that, oh wow, these were all really important. She was already gone, and you do get, you can seek all those recipes and all that, but the thing is, with Indian food, it's also deeply philosophical, right? Deeply philosophical. So very similar to the halal concept or the kosher concept. We have this concept called this. There's three stages of food. One is called sattvic, which means sattvic would mean food of the enlightened, right? And then you have rajasic, which is food for the ones who do hard labor. And then you have another sort of what's the word? It's called tamasic. So there's three stages of food: rajasic, sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic. So tamasic is food of the low conscious. So that would include putrefied food that's been cooked for more than 3 hours and left out, food that is overly salty, overly spicy, oily, processed meat. Even meat would come under tamasic. And then rajasic would be, it does include meat, but it has a certain rule of preparation. Right. Okay. So it's kind of, is it a classification system that's based on the vitality of the food itself, right? So how robust it is, or how energetic it is, or how pure it is? I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like obviously a qualitative division, right? It was more for the progress of consciousness. Gotcha. Huh.
So as you choose to, if let's just say you're a warrior,
Yeah.
you would need certain food for your vitality, for the work that you do.
Right.
But that doesn't, so vitality is one thing, but
Yes.
also how your consciousness or your state of being is when you consume those food to perform certain things. So
Yeah.
if you, let's just say, if you're more of you come from more of a learned group of people, or if you're pursuing learnings and philosophy, then the food that you consume would be more sattvic, which would be they also call it the food of the gods, the nectar of the gods, which is milk, honey, nuts, grains, food that's freshly cooked, food that does not contain certain things. So there's rules around that sort of stuff. So my grandma was very well versed, and all those food all links back to Ayurveda, which is the Hindu scripture of longevity and well-being. That's what Ayurveda means. So there was a whole philosophy around all that stuff, which unfortunately,
and it's difficult when it's the recipes are conveyed orally and not through written discourse. So it's important. That's why sometimes they say it's important to record many of the stories and the recipes and and whatnot that are conveyed to us by our grandparents, because once they're gone, they're lost to us, unfortunately. So these were clearly oral recipes. They were passed down through an oral tradition, right? Like many folklores and stories that are folkloristic in nature are passed down like that, right? So through the oral tradition, and then when the person dies, that it's no longer available. And as it's passed down, it changes over time. It morphs, right? It mutates, right? So same with recipes too. Someone adds something, someone adds another ingredient, it changes the flavor, right?
Right. And as you travel and you move around the world, you also, because a lot of these old methods of cooking, they were very, very true to the geographical location as well. So a lot of the ingredients you could only get from that place. Whereas you move to another country and then you want to emulate some of those recipes, you're not going to find those ingredients sometimes.
Yeah, totally. So let's move to the next part. So there was a question that I was really wanting to ask you. So there's a fine line between a nationalism evolving around a healthy self-concept and a pride, right? So I think there's nothing wrong with being nationalistic and being proud of your culture. And then there's ultranationalism, right? So kind of like a national pride, which evolves around collected feelings of superiority, denigration of alternate or dissimilar modes of being, and the promotion of what we say like hierarchical division, fragmentation, and separation. So I think with ultranationalism, you're kind of bordering on devaluing other cultures and elevating your own. And that can become problematic and insidious, particularly when you live in a heterogeneous society, right? Like Australia, America. So at what point do you think one can become the other? We can shift from being just nationalistic and proud of our own heritage to being ultra nationalistic and no longer inclusive. Do you know what I mean? So being exclusive. At what point?
It's the classic thinking of how the oppressed then very quickly turns into the oppressor.
Yeah, there's like that shift, isn't it? That little tweak. So because I believe that you can be proud of your background and the culture and the achievements of your culture without obviously putting down other cultures, and I think the way that one can do that is to not only glorify your own culture, but also equally glorify other cultures, right?
Absolutely.
And point out the positives in those. I think that's
And
maybe, yeah.
and that fear is real, Paul, because if we look back, like I always believe that we can't. There's this new way of thinking in the West, which is the the liberal politics of wanting to sort of like the here and the now and the future, and not wanting to look back to the past and the history to see the mistakes that collectively as human beings what we've done. And we've seen that pattern of behavior happen again and again. Like, for example, Christianity, from where it started as a teaching, and how it evolved into an institution, and how it started invading, and how it became is so toxic and powerful, from where it started, from the founder of the religion being crucified to it crucifying other people.
Yeah.
and then you see that it happened in the Hindu culture too, like how it was such a fluid, easygoing, everything goes, everyone's accepted and so pluralistic.
Yeah.
And then the Brahmanism started, and then the power shifted, and then the Brahmanical aspect of Hinduism started the caste system and started subjugating, and we see that happening again and again and again and again. And yes, I think to constantly ask yourself, are you now imposing your belief onto others?
Yeah, and telling other people and pointing the finger and saying this is how you need to do it, or this is the way that you need to live, right? You're becoming more instructional and punitive and micromanagerial and whatever word you want to put it. You're imposing yourself onto others instead of simply making this knowledge known and accessible to others, and then allowing them to access it and read it. And if it resonates for them, they can select it in as an element of their worldview or something that they'd like to adopt in moving forward. That would be a very, very different, narrative, or that would be a very, very, very different situation than actually imposing it on them, right? So the honoring one's locus of control is fundamental, right? In this, it's a huge part of the picture. So allowing someone, the ability to self-determine, to select what they're going to, to select what's going to come into their lives, or how they're going to utilize bits of information, is entirely up to that person. So you don't want to impose yourself on someone and become punitive that way.
And I think that's where I probably would add as well, Paul, sorry, is the whole idea of accountability to self and the accountability to the environment. And that's where that whole collective culture and the individualistic culture, if it can find a bridge and not war with each other, would there's a hope, or at least in theory, we could say you can extract what is working from both and dispel what didn't work, and then find a new way of living.
Yeah. Do you feel like your culture or your culture of origin has gifted you a sense of groundedness in moving forward, in that it forms part of who you are? It gives you that kind of groundedness in terms of your personal identity.
Definitely, I would agree with that. And that groundedness, I suppose, is also about it also comes from the discourse that I grew up with. When you talk about the concept of karma, for example,
yes,
it takes a very different meaning when it's used in the West, because we didn't come from a culture where you have an entity that punishes you for your action.
Right.
Karma means action and consequences. That's your action, and you have to be accountable for that.
Right.
You pay the price for what you do. No one's gonna forgive you. No
Right.
one's gonna say, okay, let's erase your past accounts, and you now have a ticket to go somewhere beautiful. That was never part of our discourse. So and I think, but of course, that concept was hijacked and it was manipulated, and it was taken. But I think in its truest sense, because of the matrilineal culture that I grew up in and how it was explained, I think that gave me a sense of grounding. Like, and I know until today, I still practice that. I won't take more than what I need.
Yeah. And the sense that I'm getting from what you've described is, I think a lot of, maybe of the Judeo-Christian cultures and tradition, what they did was that they externalized, this mechanism of, ethical sensibility and moral conscience. They externalized it. So basically it's something that belongs within the individual, in that we can feel guilty for doing something, right? It's within us, right? So we are judged by our own selves. And then we can feel immensely prideful or whatever when we do something that's appraised as benevolent. Whereas, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, they took this to a different level. They transposed these internal energies into external forces of good and bad, God and devil. And then it became this whole narrative around, post clinical death, or after your death, you go into the afterworld, the netherworld or the nether regions, where you are judged for the acts that you committed, during your lifetime. And then, right, so the positive acts on one end, and then the acts that are appraised as negative or insidious or malevolent or whatever, malignant, on the other side. And then depending on, which one weighed more was determined whether you were going to burn in hell or not. So it's a pretty interesting concept. But I think that what you're alluding to is the fact that you yourself are judged by your own self, right?
Which is interesting as well, because when we go back to that education part where we spoke about, our education system is set that way. You pass or you fail, or you've got grade 1, you've got grade 2, you've got grade 3. It comes from that thinking that you are rewarded or you're punished. You're rewarded or you're punished. Where is room for learning? Where's room for tripping up? Because there's growth there too. And
totally.
What about not doing it for someone else, but doing it for yourself?
Yeah, I agree. But these are suboptimal, these methods of getting people to conform and do the right thing. The reward punishment system, it's not terribly effective or efficacious, but we still utilize it anyway, right? As you said, true growth, true development needs to be self-motivated and come from within, right? So it's interesting. So one thing that I wanted to talk about was also racism, right? So as we know that racism comes in many permutations and guises. So there can be systemic racism, there can be internalized, right? There can be institutional, casual, and so forth. Would you be able to describe your most salient experience of racism in Australia?
It happens in different forms every day, Paul, depending on where the context is. I probably would say, I think the overarching issue here is that it's very similar to America, where it's got a very, very dark history, very dark history of how the country was formed, and there's a lot of it's been buried. The past has been buried, and so it's still there.
Yeah,
it manifests itself in different ways. Like it's not even comparable to America in some ways, because at least in America, I suppose, yes, there's still a lot of struggles with that, but there's already people who are third generation, fourth generation,
Yeah.
fifth generation of mixed cultures. Whereas here, I think it's still very new, you know, it's still very sort of, even if it's been happening, there seems to be one race that gets the dominant
Right.
preference in a mixed culture family.
Right. You feel like maybe there's more cultural cohesion here, right? There's been kind of like a, I don't know, like a melting of different perspectives together, or different cultural perspectives together. Whereas they're kind of more discrete and delineated, and right, not having merged very well.
How I would describe this is that it still carries a lot of the prudish British mindset. And I think although the UK has moved forward, because Australia is so isolated, I think also geographically and in so many other aspects as well, it retained a lot of that prudish thinking, and it's still here. It's like the stepchild of Great Britain.
Yeah.
It's pissed off, it's angry, it's a bit spoiled, it's you know, it's wealthy, you know, and it doesn't want to change, you know.
And what you're saying kind of is very evocative for me. It's very reminiscent of the fact that, you know, first and second generation families in Australia, particularly, I mean, you know that I'm Greek Australian, so many of those families just really, really hold on to their oral traditions, you know, their folkloristic beliefs, their religion aggressively, right? And then you look at the Greeks who have kind of moved on. Do you know what I mean? So you make a comparison, you're like, what's going on here? These Greeks, you know, from mainland Greece, from Greece proper, have become much more progressive, right? They're much more receptive to other ideas, other modes of being.
But that I can understand, Paul. You know why?
Yeah.
Because you see, like, I think, you know, whether it's the Italian community, the Greek community, or the Jewish community, I don't think they're dominant cultures by nature.
Right.
I think that for them is, yes, things have changed in their home country, but I can relate to that because that was similar to the Indian community in Malaysia, where because the dominant culture was so suffocating and there was an expectation of you to confirm, there's this sense of, I'm going to lose my identity, so they hold on to it a lot more. And I can see that. But what annoys me as well is that as a migrant who've come here, I've connected very well with the Greek community, the Italian community, and you know, to a certain extent, I do have a lot of Jewish people in my life, you know. So if I can put the effort to get to know all these other different cultures that are there, I don't know many white Anglo-Australians who are even interested in that. They almost somehow get fetishized or I feel like eating spanakopita, you know, and let's go to a Greek restaurant, and that's all they know about Greek culture. Which is ridiculous because it's still very segregated. I don't see it sort of like merging and blending in. It gets appropriated, you know, some aspects of it gets taken, some aspects of it gets discarded. Like I still hear, you know, white Anglo-Aussie men making fun of, you know, Greek men bonding with each other.
Or,
you know,
that happens.
So, and you know, or you know, all sorts of little remarks there. So for me, that is power. That's the old English superiority complex that they carry. And I can see why minority cultures who come here are fearful that they will have to. Why would you lose your thousands of year old culture to adopt to that shit? I mean, let's just be honest, right?
And that's exactly right. And I think a lot of it is cultural, but I think a lot of it might also be personal as well. Characterological, maybe. I don't know if I want to call it that. Some people are just, you know, will gravitate towards exploring other cultures more. You know, like you have a sense of I don't know, some people just are more judgmental, highly judgmental, and, are just dominated or overawed by their own schemas, or overrun, I should say, by their own schemas, and don't exhibit that much curiosity, aren't curious about other ways of being, and other modes of existence. So they stick with what they know, and then they think that what they know and the way that they live is the end all be all. Do you know what I mean? It's I don't know. It's kind of like, I don't know how to describe feeling, imminent, inherent feelings of superiority. I don't know what it evokes in them, and then that inhibits them or prohibits them or encumbers them from actually going out into the world and actually learning about these other cultures, and these other ways of doing things, I think. So I think a lot of it may be characterological as well. It might be personal. And then a lot of it might be attitudes which they've inherited from, from their familial environment, from their parents, for instance, or their uncles and aunts, who will make, heinous comments about the man next door who is Indian or Italian and Greek and does this and that. So,
And also, Paul, also, right, the
Mm.
context of the situation of the culture as well. Like, if you come from a culture that had gone through war and disparity and genocide, and
yeah,
it's always shifting. It does influence the way you view the world. Like, you're constantly being moved. So the quest of wanting to live and wanting to find out more is there. But
yes,
it's a bit like Centrelink culture here as well. Like,
yeah,
if you've been given and given and given and given, you're only going to live within that parameter.
yeah,
And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying social security is bad, but it comes with a duality. One, it's a safety network to keep you safe. And then on the other side, what it creates is generations of people who don't want to move away from that. So if you come from a culture where, you don't have natural calamity, you've never had a financial crisis, you've never had any of that difficulty, then you're pretty much, you live in a bubble. This is all you know. Why do you need to know?
yeah, yeah.
You never need to know.
Yes, and we are creatures that are immensely comfortable as well. We become comfortable with our life circumstances and our contingencies, right? So sometimes that's where the axiom comes from: better the devil you know than the one that you don't. Do you know what I mean? So you're not sure about anything outside of your own box. So why should I emerge, from my box and attempt to learn more when I'm comfortable over here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you look at it historically, that is
Yeah.
usually the beginning of a decay of a civilization.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's exactly right. Degeneration begins there. Absolutely. Yep. I suppose we can equate it with individuals who reach an age of 80 and 86, do you know what I mean? And start to withdraw from society, right? So there's a kind of a turning inward and an internal preoccupation, and are no longer are no longer interacting with the environment, and no longer stimulated by the environment. They don't allow themselves to be stimulated by by their five senses. There's a complete withdrawal and rejection of other people. There's a paucity of relationship in their life, and then gradually they begin to experience what we call neurodegeneration, and they become demented. So it's almost similar. Do you know what I mean? So there's a sense of, you pointed to the degeneration of culture. Same thing happens within the individual when they disengage from their social environment, right? So it becomes noxious. Anyway, yes, I think that, we've gone by an hour. So I think we should probably close. But one thing that I wanted to ask you before closing was, is there anything else of, any significance or importance that we've left out that you'd like to share with the audience, or any messages that you wish to convey?
I think we've pretty much covered quite a lot today, Paul.
Yeah. We covered a lot of ground.
We have. I think probably what I would say is keep that reflective process.
Yeah.
On, like, a lot of people, especially in the culture that we live in, it's like it's considered too much brain work, or you're overthinking, or
Yeah.
and I disagree with that. I think as a human being, you're constantly in a process of reflecting. You're reflecting on your actions, reflecting on your environment, reflecting on the consequences that you cause, and I think if you can accept that, and accept that that's a part of living and being, then it doesn't become work. It's not. And yeah, and I think, I probably would just end with that.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think that, people just aren't introspective enough, and they operate kind of like on pilot mode, right? So like automatons, and reflexively,
And
and
that's
yep.
that's the binary of what you said, Paul. Like,
Yeah.
you're either focused on external stimulation only,
Yeah.
or you are focused on the internal only.
Yes.
There is a duality, and that's the war.
Yes.
Again, we go back,
Yes, back and forth, right? Yeah.
Back and forth. But if we can reconcile both,
yeah,
I think, for me at least, I think that's where growth happens.
Yeah, totally. There's a degree of cognitive flexibility that is required, though. We need to be cognitively flexible for that to happen. I think as we get older, we become a little bit more rigid, regimented in the way that we see the world, and we don't allow this information in anymore, right? I kind of see it with myself too. I don't know if you notice it. As you get older, you're much more resistant to things that are emerging now, like avant-garde things, things in media, right? Social media, like apps, new apps that I sometimes hear about these new apps, and I'm like, oh no, I don't want anything to do with that. So, and that's where I see my own cognitive rigidity. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, oh, that's a bit unusual for me to say. I'm becoming a little bit rigid that way. Why wouldn't I want to learn about this app, and move forward with the times? So I think as we get older, that happens to us a little bit. We want to remain in our comfort zones, So yeah, it's difficult to balance the two, that's for sure. And it gets more challenging with age. In any case, let's leave it there and round off there. And thank you so much for being on the channel. I have enjoyed it immensely, and I hope that you have too.
I have, Paul. Thank you so much.
All right. Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, yep. And we will see each other around anyway. All right. Take care and enjoy your day.
Okay.
I'll see you soon. All right. Bye. Bye.